Okay, so I'm just going to start talking then, okay? And I didn't prepare anything visual, so you're going to have to, unfortunately, well, you don't have to look at my head. You can, please don't, actually. It makes me self-conscious. But all right, so what I'm going to present um, for you this evening is based on the introductory chapter to uh, one of the books coming out in 2024 called Imaginary Power, Real Horizons. The introductory chapter of that book is called A Question of Imagination. What can it mean to be a communist today? A question of imagination. And so I'm going to present an answer to the question of what can it mean to be a communist today? But before attempting to answer that question, I should tell you that I'm going to offer an answer from a communist point of view, not the communist point of view, because there isn't only one of those. Communists often disagree, Marxists disagree, anarchists, socialists, liberals, conservatives, feminists disagree on what is feminism, how it ought to be oriented. Um, there's all kinds of things happening in queer theory, in feminist philosophy, that are trying to recalibrate orientations of the subfield. So there are many different communist answers or answers to that question from a communist point of view, but I'm going to answer from the one that I think is the best. I mean, I guess I shouldn't give you the one that I think is the worst. The best answer for historical, philosophical, and also for political reasons. And I would be happy to discuss any of those reasons, philosophical, historical, or political, with you further if you are interested. So I think the best place to begin answering the question, what it can mean to be a communist today, is with Marx's definition of communism, which you can find in one of the readings I gave you, the German ideology. And let me just show you where I'm going to be reading from, because it's on a page. I'll be reading from 179. Yes, of that text that John is holding up. I'll be reading a definition from page 179. Friedrich Engels and Marx provided a definition of communism in the German ideology. And one of the things that I do is I keep close to Marx's original definition of communism. I keep close to what were his philosophical and conceptual, philosophical, historical, political intentions with defining communism. And actually, many communists and Marxists don't do that. And also, no anti-communists do that. No anti-communists, people who are, already predisposed against Marx's ideas, will never begin with Marx's original definition of communism, because for ideological reasons, those people would prefer to preserve a particular view of communism, which is demonstrably false and cannot be supported outside of a particular ideological dispute or debate. So, okay, what did Marx say on that page? I think I mentioned it was 179 underneath the line break. And he gives a definition as follows: communism is for us not a stable state, which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. Okay. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence. Now, this early definition of communism, which Marx wrote at the age of 28, he stuck to until the end of his life. And it's a great definition in philosophical terms because it opens with what's called the negative definition. In other words, it's a statement of what communism is not, right? And then it follows with a sentence, it's a positive definition. So let's take the negative definition, the statement of what communism is not. And by the way, here's one example of exegesis or unpacking. It's the kind of thing we do when we hang out, when you hang out with me. Um, so Marx says that communism is not a stable state to establish. And he never really, abandoned that position. It's not, communism is not something you establish. It's not something you name. It's not a building, an artifact. It's not a government. Communism is something we do. It's a process, not an end state. It's not an ideal. It's not some idea to which reality has to adjust itself, as he says. So it is a process. It is not an ideal. It's not an ideal process that we merely imagine. And when you look at the second sentence of the definition, what is called the positive definition, you can see that it's a statement of what communism is. And what he says is that it is a real movement, real in italics. This means that communism is an actually happening movement or a historical process, but it's not just any real movement or historical process. It's only the movement, only the historical process that abolishes the present state of things. Do you see that qualification? Because you can talk about all kinds of real movements in the world, political, social, economic, ideological. You can talk about all kinds of real movements, but this is a real movement. It's not an ideological movement. That's a different feature of the German ideology, but I'll save that in case you have questions about that afterwards. It's a real movement that abolishes the present state of things. So it cannot be a process of keeping the present state of things, yet modifying them in some way or another. It's abolitionist. And one of the terms that you find all throughout the German ideology and the Grundrisse and the Communist Manifesto and other writings of Marx is that word, which is often neglected in Marx's writing, abolition. He can't get enough of the word. He uses it 5 or 6 times in the German ideology, several times just in the excerpts I gave you, which are not the entire book, 2 or 3 times in the excerpts I gave you. So it's a process, an abolitionist process, a real movement that participates in some kind of abolitionist process. So, for example, a communist would not want to make slavery kinder and gentler for the slave. When one approach to slavery, which was very popular, was we cannot abolish slavery. We have to make it better for the slave. Right? That was a very popular approach to chattel slavery, the transatlantic slave trade. The abolitionist idea was considered a very radical position. And so if you look at people like Benjamin Lay or Margaret Sanger, Marcus Rediker wrote a great book on Benjamin Lay, the Quaker abolitionist, recently. Or if you look at John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry, there's a whole range of abolitionist approaches. Well, Marx was an abolitionist, it turns out, on the question of slavery. He was not a reformer, and he even communicated that in a letter to Abraham Lincoln, which all of you should look up. It's fascinating. Robin Blackburn, a wonderful historian who I'm not sure if he's still at the New School for Social Research, but he was there when I was there. Robin Blackburn wrote a book called Unfinished Revolution, which is about Marx's letter to Lincoln. And it's pretty remarkable. Marx is sort of like, this is great, and you've gotten rid of slavery. Now you have to abolish slave labor and all these other things. You have to keep on going. The abolitionist project isn't over. And then W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, who was a Marxist who wrote The Black Reconstruction and The Souls of Black Folk. He also insisted that abolition did not end with the abolition of slavery. It had to keep on going, because if you abolish slavery but not white supremacy can relocate or can find other infrastructures within society, criminal justice system. We can look in other locations to find where does white supremacy go. So now communism, then we could say, if we stick with Marx, is an abolitionist movement. And what it abolishes has to be something defining of the present reality, right? The It's a strange phrase, right? The present state of things. And it's tricky because the present state of things is not today what it was in 1846, right? The present state of things is different, a few weeks from now may not be what it is now, right? So when you think about the present abolition of the present state of things, you have to look at what is the present state of things. And that means that communists always have to rethink their targets because the present never stays put. It never stays the same. So one question or one way of approaching an answer to the question of what it means to be a communist today is to ask the question is what has got to be abolished? You know, what would be worthy of a real movement that was abolitionist in its orientation? Finally, in that definition from the German ideology, Marx adds, quote, the conditions of this movement result from the premises now in existence. So for him, what that meant was looking at the conditions of class conflict in globalizing industrial societies, looking at the gap between the haves and the have-nots, looking at what he called in the Communist Manifesto the emergence of two great hostile camps. That was his phrase, two great hostile camps, as he said 2 years later in the Communist Manifesto. So what I want to point out to all of you is how a few sentences from Marx's German ideology actually get us pretty far in answering our question. Right? They actually get us pretty far in answering our question. A communist should think about present conditions of life that cannot be reformed and therefore require abolition. A communist would think about really existing premises that give rise to really happening movements. A communist in the United States, for example, in recent years, would think about resurgent white supremacy, might think about Black Lives Matter uprisings, might think about a range of activism surrounding ecology, sexuality, and gender. And as it turns out, those are all things that communists are paying very close attention to. Communists also take sides with real movements when they cannot participate in them directly. And they don't take sides with those who defend the existing conditions against real movements from below. This from below part could be elaborated further if you're interested in that qualification. It's not in that quote, but it's a crucial feature of Marx's thinking. So furthermore, among those who do want to change things, whether that means addressing problems of racism or capitalism or ecological destruction, sexism, communists will try to identify the abolitionist dimension or the most radical position, the one that demands attention to root causes. And I'm going to talk about radicality and root causes and the etymology of the radicalis at the end of this talk. So I want you to keep that in mind. But this is important because Marx was interested in revolutionary processes. He was, for him, what it meant to be a communist was to be a revolutionary. Okay, now, so communism is an active abolitionist opposition to the world as it is. That's just straight out of the early Marx and the late Marx. We're not confronting the same Manchester capitalism of Marx's life and times, but the world is no less governed by the basic logics of capital. It's no less ruled by money. And class society, I mean, globally now, has not seen so much global inequality as exists today. So sometimes social scientists will find one location, one town, one city, one state. But if you read UNDP program reports, and if you look at mainstream organizations like Oxfam, and you look even in the United States, the website is not, it's gotten a lot worse, but the Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org, they used to have, which other political scientists than me would love it. You could run their data in all kinds of different configurations, that's become much more limited. But if you look at some of the macroeconomic uh, uh, conditions of the world, um, some of the basic things are in place, and also some of the um, inequalities and precarities of life are even worse than they were in Marx's time. So whatever else has changed, I think it's important to point out that capitalism still describes the social, political, and economic realities in most of the world. We should talk about what is capitalism. It's a single session. It's not a whole semester, but we can try with the time that we have. But if communism is uh, is a real movement, then we have to ask not only what it aims to abolish, but what does it want to move towards? Because remember, I said before there was a good definition because I had a negative and a positive side. And one of the problems with Marxism, which anybody who reads Marx and talks to other people who study Marx confronts not long after they start, is, well, okay, we know what you're criticizing. We have the negation, but what is the negation of the negation? What is the positive thing that you're moving towards, or what would you aim towards? You're against some things, but what are you for? And there is um, in Marx's body of work, there is a concept and a term that he found in G.W.F. Hegel, an earlier German philosopher, that he retained and has a kind of a fixation on it. He really loves this word, and it's a German word that's always left. Can I type it in here? Here, let me do it this way. I'll put it up in the chat. It's Gemeinwesen, and it's always left in the German untranslated. You can see that, right? I put that in there for everyone. So, and he writes a lot about Gemeinwesen. Now, if you do like a translate from German to English, it will say a community. I think it just says community. But it's always left in the German in translated texts because it has kind of a more complicated connotations. Gemeinwesen is like a communal being, a communal sensibility. Like the Gemein is the common, and the Wesen is like the essence of community. And so Marx will sometimes talk about the existing Gemeinwesen and the Gemeinwesen towards which would be healthy. And he juxtaposes sort of healthy and unhealthy Gemeinwesens, which can be seen in the real world. They're not just ideals. So Marx, for Marx, communism was not an arbitrary word. It's connected to Gemeinwesen, and it's connected to community, communal being, common sensibility. I always tell my students, if you ever want to know what an ism means, like, conservatism, you should, because ism always indicates a worldview or ideological position, you should go to the root, and like, if you want to know, I said we haven't defined capitalism, but capitalism is a worldview, the center of which is capital, or the accumulation of capital. And it also means other things. Of course, it's not simply that, insofar as capitalism describes a society and so forth. But communism, the center of it is the Gemeinwesen. At least for Marx, it's always communism. The center of the ism is the common, the Gemein, and Gemeinwesen. So for Marx, the question was always, we abolish what presently exists, but we have to move towards healthy human relations, or a different Gemeinwesen. Now, so this is what I was saying before about this other book coming out in 2024 with my friend Bruno, Communist Ontologies. This is an ontological reading of Marx, where what we're talking about is communism as forms of life and social relations, not as forms of government. And that is how I think it's the most faithful reading of Marx's work. And there's many reasons, and there's much evidence that we could marshal for that, I would argue. But because I do that, because I focus on communism as forms of life, not forms of government, I am advocating thinking about communism or answering the question of this talk in such a way that Vladimir Lenin diagnosed in 1920, he would have diagnosed me as having what he called an infantile disorder. And I'm just being honest. Lenin said that. He wrote a text in 1920 called Left Communism, an Infantile Disorder. And it's a powerful, beautiful essay by Lenin. It's like, and what he's talking about are his communist critics, because, I mean, one of the first things that came right out of the gates at Lenin were criticisms from Marxists. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that, because we often have been acculturated to this Cold War ideology, or this Cold War discourse, I should say, in which, you know, there's Marxism on one side, communism on one side, and capitalism on the other side. And many people don't understand that some of the most ferocious, outspoken critics of the Soviet Union already in 1917 were Marxists. So like a month after it happened, the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci wrote an essay in November of 1917 called The Revolution Against Capital, in which what he was saying was this revolution in Russia was a complete betrayal of Marx's whole philosophy of historical materialism. Gramsci loved the Russian Revolution, but he also came, and people like Rosa Luxemburg, and there's a long history of these people who were critics. But one of the things that, you know, Lenin had a point. I mean, Lenin's point was, you're thinking about principles, you're thinking about ideas, and right now, the world beneath our feet is crumbling. You know, we don't have the luxury to do philosophy. We've just had a revolution and people are going to die. We've got to figure out what to do next. So stop criticizing. Stop criticizing. So, well, I think Lenin had a point, because in the context of a revolutionary situation, you don't necessarily want to talk about what is the Gemeinwesen, you know, all of that stuff. You don't want to get into a big discussion about Hegel. But there is now, I think, I mean, obviously, we're not living in a time of, you know, 1848, 1871, the Paris Commune, 1917, the Russian Revolution. We're not living in the same time period, the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th. And we can think about principles, and we must. And communism today, I think, there's a long history of communism that distrusts, and ruthlessly criticizes all ruling classes and all political parties, including even those that claim to be working class parties or proletarian parties. There's a long history of those Marxists. And I think today is the time for that type of approach. Also, Marx himself, in one of his last major works, which I strongly recommend, and I'll put it here in the chat, Critique of the Gotha Program. And so those of you who are taking the graduate seminar will be looking at this tomorrow in our seminar, Critique of the Gotha Program. Marx took great pains to insist that left-wing political parties that wanted to take state power, that called themselves communist, and he named them. I mean, they were specific. They just drafted a program in Gotha of the Social Democratic Party, the German Workers' Party, and the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And they called it the Gotha Program. And they said, this is our plan. It's, you know, we're going to put Marx's ideas to work in electoral politics in Germany. We're going to have social democracy and all of this stuff. And Marx, before he died, he wrote a critique of the Gotha Program. And it was Marx at his ferocious best. I mean, Marx was, you know, he had boils. He was in pain. He was pissed off. He was on fire when he wrote this. Every sentence he would quote, and then he would say, it's the opposite. You just look at the structure of the Critique of the Gotha Program. It's powerful. You know, every sentence was wrong, according to Marx. He said that that these were all contradictions in terms, that you can't have communism come through in this way as a form of government through electoral politics. It doesn't make any sense. He understood long ago before. He could obviously comment on that people like Bernie Sanders, who would be characterized as socialists, were not socialists, were not Marxists, were not communists. I mean, he had different people that he was talking about in his time, people like Ferdinand Lassalle and others, but you can see it's not much of an extrapolation. And there's a long line of Marxists who share these orientations I'm describing, not only Marx himself, but Anton Pannekoek, Sylvia Pankhurst, Cornelius Castoriadis, the great Black writer who wrote The Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James, one of the best. I really recommend C.L.R. James. Was a sports writer, but he was also one of the greatest Marxist critics of the Soviet Union, and Raya Dunayevskaya, all the way up to the Autonomia movement from Italy. My co-author is associated with that for the book Communist Ontologies, and a long history of efforts to distinguish, as Antonio Negri and Felix Guattari called it, communists like us. In other words, ontological communists who were thinking about communism as different forms of life. Now, one way to make the case for the positive, the positive Gemeinwesen, not just the critique of everything now existing. One way to make the case for it is to invoke Marx's, actually articulated his dream for the better Gemeinwesen. I mean, he actually wrote about it in the Critique of the Gotha Program. And probably all of you, if not all of you, certainly some of you have heard of it. It's one of the most famous things Marx ever wrote. It's the motto, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. It's, and he thought that this was the Gemeinwesen to aim at, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And, it partly explains why I wrote a book. The last book I wrote is called The Communism of Love, because I was looking to locate this Gemeinwesen from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, in real and active relationships. So like if I think about my kids or my friends, or if you think about your friends or your family or a lover, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs is not a bad idea. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't tell my 9-year-old that, he only eats in a network of exchange relations. Like, if he doesn't clean up his room, he gets no dinner. I mean, I might say that. Well, I don't say that, but one could say that. But here's the secret. If any of you have parents who still say this bullshit, they're gonna feed you. Or they should. Okay, I don't want to over assume or be presumptuous on that, but there is a different logic of relations that all of us, if we're fortunate, have some experience with. And it's not some fantastical philosophical dream. It's basically how you interact with people you care about. And like, I know that if I needed to talk to John about something, John and Ali are my friends. I know that if I needed to talk about John about something, he would not charge me $20 an hour for his time. He would be there. He would say, "What do you need?" And actually, friends do that. They say, "If there's anything you need, let me know." And they don't mean that you have to pay for it. And so I try to think about this Gemeinwesen, because I do think all of us carve out spaces where we set up the barricades, to use a Paris Commune idea, around the Gemeinwesens that matter most. And they are according to a different logic. And also, prior to the Communism of Love, I wrote a very short book called Precarious Communism, in which I was also thinking about this question of what can it mean to be a communist today. Now, a precarious communist, what I was thinking about in that book, is a communist who has no strident confidence about their ability to abolish the present reality. So a lot of times, like, people would ask Marxists questions, how are you going to get there? What are you going to do? And part of what it means to be a precarious communist is that you say you don't know how to get there. Okay? You can say you don't know. And the time of dogmatic uh, Marxism, if we can even talk about that now, that is over. It's just bizarre that anyone with a historical, an understanding of historical struggles of the 20th century would would want their Marxists to be dogmatic. So, some of the most dangerous men of history knew exactly what to do. Some of the most dangerous men of history had exactly the solution. Sometimes they thought it was the final solution. Um, and yeah, well, you can. I say on my mind, of course, is what's happening a lot right now in the Middle East. We can maybe put that on the shelf for now, but we can think about it too. Anyway, communists who claim to know what to do, how to get from point A to point B, they belong in the dustbins of history, I would argue. And the only thing about which a precarious communist can have a good deal of confidence is that the violence, racism, I would argue, immorality, and unsustainability of capitalism, that they're connected, that these things are connected to capitalism, that capitalism can remain at the center of a critique of the present conditions and the problems we face. For ecological reasons, I would argue, for ethical reasons, for existential reasons, and this is adequate grounding for for being a communist today. So, I mean, I love Ali's book, his first book on the it's a very long title, Ali.
Oh, no problem. The patterning of life. Yeah.
This
Right.
is an awesome book. Yeah,
Right.
I'm holding it up. I love this book, right? And the only problem with this book is that, in my opinion, and I think it's a great book, but Ali doesn't point out enough how these problems of patenting life and the privatization of biological organisms has a motivation
Mhm.
in the logic of capitalist political economy. And so, I mean, it's a fantastic book. You all should read it. It's a great book. But once we understand the connection between some of these problems, um, and and capitalism, we can go on talking about these communism, Marxism, capitalism, and I think it's necessary also to acknowledge that capitalism does remain the dominant ideology of the world. And it's also necessary to note that the problems of the world, including authoritarian resurgences in West Africa and in Europe, inequalities in healthcare, increasingly bold and open white supremacist movements, and many other problems, they are problems of the existing reality. And the reason I want to say that now very clearly is because oftentimes when I talk about these things, people say, I'm going to imagine all of the problems that communism can't solve. And what I like to point out is that the whole litany of problems you conjure, crime, violence, poverty, and war, all of them are already features of the society we have. In other words, how are you going to solve poverty? Well, how are you going to solve it? It's not really a sort of a ad hominem tit for tat kind of a thing, but problems are very hard to solve. Real problems are extremely, the ecological problem is extremely difficult to solve, but it simply won't do to say, it simply won't do to say, if you can't solve the problems of crime, violence, poverty, and war, you've got nothing. Because, I mean, all of the political philosophies of the past and present um, have not been able to solve all of these problems either, but they still have virtues. The Adam Smith's *The Wealth of Nations* is a wonderful book. He didn't know he was writing what would be considered a work of modern economics. He thought he was doing moral philosophy. It was just another book like A Theory of Moral Sentiments for him. He was surprised. But he would have been surprised how it was taken up as an economic text. But the point that I'm making is you can't, you know, he talked about the policy of Europe, the liberal reformers dealing with inequality, and they haven't solved the problems of inequality either. So it's well, it's a problem that you can't solve problems. It's absolutely a problem that you can't solve problems. But you know, but but political philosophies have other things to offer than solutions for every problem. Now, some may wonder then, why would you, RGO, why would you, Gilman-Opalsky, even want to bother to continue to use this language of communism to talk about anything today? I mean, it's polluted. It's ideologically been ideologically taken hostage, and it's almost irretrievable. I've been reading a transcript for an article, a different article that I'm working on, of Trump speeches in 2023. And by the way, um, you're welcome. I'll do it so you don't have to. I'm reading transcripts of Trump speeches, and I want you to know that his speeches are packed full of the words Marxism, socialism, and communism. And the White House.gov, when Trump was in power, released a, I think, 60 to 70 page text on the dangers of socialism in America. So it's not, I mean, people are talking about communism a lot. They're talking about Marxism, perhaps in a way is quite surprising to people like me. Many of us thought that the discourse would be dead and buried in the mid to late 90s and the early 2000s, but it's made a roaring comeback since 2008. And I think we have to use the language of communism and capitalism for as long as it's useful. I mean, I'm kind of a big advocate of making use of useful things in philosophy, concepts and terms. Um, and for as long as we can continue to understand the existing reality with this discursive apparatus, you know, whether we're talking about class analysis or whether we're talking about what is capitalism and what are exchange values or use values, what is communism, I think it's crucial for us to make use of a useful discursive apparatus. Um, and as long as life is governed mostly by the logic of capital, for as long as it is ruled by money as a power of human freedom and exploitation, I think we have to keep talking about capitalism too. I don't want to just talk about communism. I want to talk about capitalism a lot. Right? I like talking about capitalism and communism and socialism and anarchism and feminism. I love the isms. I even have a class that used to be called isms until one of my colleagues pointed out that isms wasn't a word. I didn't name the original class. I inherited it. So it's changed, but it's still an isms class. Um, well, for as long as we want to juxtapose uh, the present state of things to some ideas of a radically different Gemeinwesen or a radically different state of things, I think we're going to have to keep speaking about communism. And I would also say something really very Marxist, which is that describing the world with different words doesn't change it, right? So it's not really a language problem. The problem is, what are the limitations of the mode of analysis? And every mode of analysis, including Marx's, has uh, very serious limitations. And all modes of analysis uh, in political science and in philosophy have limitations that must be discussed. Okay. Now, one of the more interesting examples of the enduring relevance of communism is in the case of Kohei Zaito. Now, I sent you all through John and Ali a New York Times article on Zaito. It's really a pretty crappy article. Yeah, I mean, it's okay. I was happy to see that Zaito was covered in the New York Times, but you know, there's better things that you can find probably, but it seemed good enough. Well, Zaito is a young professor. I mean, he's born in 1987. So, I mean, I think that's young, but I'm starting to realize that I might be old, and I'm not sure about that yet. But Zaito is a young professor born in 1987, and he's a professor of philosophy and political economy at the University of Tokyo. This is an interesting story. He wrote an openly Marxist book that became a bestseller in Japan. This story of Kohei Zaito is fascinating. You should look into it. That's part of the reason I sent the New York Times article. But if you get on a train in Tokyo, there are advertisements with Kohei Zaito's face on them. You know, there's like he's a minor celebrity. Um, it's in one of the most hyper capitalist societies of the present, right? I mean, so think about countries like South Korea and Japan, and some conditions of a life of constant work, like hikikomori. Um, you can look and see that there are, or karoshi, which is death by overwork. Um, you know, that people are interested in capitalism in these hyper capitalist cultures of overwork, or karoshi, work over death. Overwork death is the translation of karoshi. um, and so he wrote a book, Zaito wrote a book called Marx in the Anthropocene. This is a theory book, and it's like digging into Marx. It's doing like an exegesis of Marx's Grundrisse. This book sold 500,000 copies in about 6 months in Japan. The book is widely discussed throughout Japan. It's constantly on television and in radio programs, advertisements everywhere, immediately translated all around the world, just published in 2022 in English by Cambridge University Press. And he reasonably expected to just be an obscure academic, but he ended up as a minor celebrity. I would say probably still a minor celebrity, but still probably people know his name. He's a household name. Well, is that minor? I don't know. It's pretty major, I think. He argues that this is his argument. I was to sum it up very quickly because I want to draw to a close here in about 10 minutes. Zaito argues that capitalism requires perpetual growth. That one thing that the logic of capital requires is accumulation and growth, right? So capitalism, by definition, I mean, even like neoclassical economists, who are the least critical economists of capitalism, they say that if you don't have 3% compound growth per annum, it's an economic crisis. In other words, it's a growth logic. It's a growth logic. Now, Saito says this is irreducible feature of capitalism. And he argues that from a capitalist point of view, we know that insufficient growth means economic sickness and even political sickness. And the opposite of growth, degrowth, equals death. I mean, degrowth from an economic point of view is the catastrophe for capitalism, because capitalism is all about growth, extraction. Degrowth is the opposite direction. It's a death sentence for capitalism. But what Zaito argues is that the growth and extraction imperatives of capitalism exacerbate the climate crisis, that the climate crisis of the present, that is an existential crisis of the world, of the present, of the existing reality, the present state of affairs, that the climate crisis that we face, according to Zaito, requires degrowth. Degrowth. It requires degrowth. And that degrowth may be a death sentence for capitalism, but it's actually necessary for the continuation of life on Earth. So the subtitle of his book is Towards the Idea of Degrowth Communism. It's called Marx and the Anthropocene, Towards the Idea of Degrowth Communism. And Zaito warns, and now I'm quoting Zaito, not from that New York Times article, quote, "If we don't stop capitalism, the history of humanity will come to an end." Sounds like a catastrophism, you know, doom and despair. That has happened many times in the past. However, the ecological, I mean, you know, sometimes it's real. Can you imagine the dinosaurs walking around saying, "Oh, we've heard about our extinction for a long time." You know, plate tectonics and brontosaurus, and, or I guess it's a brachiosaurus now. And they talk about their extinction and it's never happened. And then, okay. Well, if degrowth is antithetical to capitalism, a movement of degrowth would occupy the position of communism, because one of the other defining features of Marx's philosophy is that communism is the antithesis to capitalism. It has got to be the abolitionist opposite of capitalism. So, like me, Zaito, I agree with Zaito, insists that communism can't be some kind of a statist, so-called communism, communist form of government. We're not talking about the Soviet Union. We're not talking about China. And by the way, as a side note, please do a search on Mao Zedong's On State Capitalism, a short piece he published in 1953, in which he insists that his China is capitalist, right? He calls it a state capitalist country. Nobody was surprised except for people in the United States who were involved in Cold War ideological battles. Everybody understood, and Mao himself insisted that China was a state capitalist country, right? And this is basically what CLR James and Raya Dunayevskaya and many others were saying. It's two forms of capitalism. There's state capitalism, bureaucratic capitalism in China and the Soviet Union. And then there is free market capitalism in the United States, where the state takes a more passive role. And the administered economies of China and the Soviet Union are not communist, they are state capitalist. Well, Mao totally agreed with that. And it's very simple to see that in his own words in a piece called On State Capitalism. Well, ecology is one place where we can see what it may mean to be a communist today. There are other examples. We can be communists in abolitionist movements against white supremacy. You know, you've all probably heard about Antifa. I think that you have all heard about that Antifa in the United States, the black-clad anarchists who, and they go and they try to cancel or deplatform, and they've been in the news not very recently, but recently enough. What you should know is that Antifa is short for anti-fascist. So people who are opposed to Antifa, if they finish the sentence and they don't go with the short form, I mean, the sentence goes something like this: I'm opposed to anti-fascists, because Antifa actually was coined in the Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic, the first signs that said Antifa, you can find photographs of them. You can find photographs of them of massive gatherings of thousands of people under the banner Antifaschistisch Action, which was the militant anti-fascist group in the Weimar Republic. It was around from 1932 to 1933, and they were the last stand against Hitler's Nazi Germany. They were the last stand inside the Weimar Republic. And they were, it turns out, they called themselves communists. There are other things that we can take an abolitionist approach to. Mass incarceration, which has become more, Michelle Alexander wrote a great book on the new Jim Crow. This semester, I'm teaching in a maximum security prison. And I'm teaching a class in a maximum security prison. And I have to tell you, and maybe you'll just say, I'm not surprised that you would say this, but whenever I leave that prison, I would like to live in a world where it doesn't exist. I mean, I will just tell you that and there are people who are talking about abolitionist politics around mass incarceration, abolitionist politics around sexism, around racism. Well, obviously, many who join those movements do not call themselves communists. I mean, Black children in the United States who walk around with a carceral consciousness. It's a philosopher, Tommy J. Curry. He wrote about the carceral consciousness of being Black in America, where even as a young boy, he wrote about boys. Curry wrote about boys and young men. You'd be 14 years old, and you'd be walking around as a 14-year-old in middle school with a consciousness about the lopsided likelihood that you would, or someone you know would, end up incarcerated, and that this consciousness. And so people who are opposed to mass incarceration and the carceral consciousness, they don't care if people who are working to abolish white supremacy call themselves communists. But I do think words matter. Now, let me come to the end. And one of the things we have a lot of, and you're surrounded by them, it's basically the whole world that you live in. I think for most of you, wherever you may be, you're surrounded by liberals, you're surrounded by conservatives who, like communists and Marxists, can't answer all the problems solve all the problems or answer all the questions either. But if you take a look at the discursive landscape of the predominant uh, uh, political conversation, you can see things that are missing. You can see things, but you can also see things that are missing. So, for example, liberals oftentimes want to hold killer cops accountable. They don't like that. I mean, there were many liberals, as you probably can remember, who were very happy when Derek Chauvin, who had his knee on the neck of George Floyd, was found guilty of murder. But they tend to think generally, I would say, and the discourse reflects this of liberalism in America, that the problem is Derek Chauvin. And it's not so much a problem of white supremacy that can reproduce Chauvin in other cops with different names and different bodies, which is to say, white supremacy doesn't go with Derek Chauvin into a cell, any more than the abolition of slavery abolishes white supremacy. Liberals are not thinking about these problems generally. I know this isn't a generalization, but I would stand by it, and I would submit some particular pieces of evidence in support of this. But liberals, they're not they're not talking about the abolition of mass incarceration. The abolition of police and Black Lives Matter was considered a very radical position, which liberals shied away from. I mean, you can just go and look and see how in the most recent presidential election, abolitionist discourses around police violence were taken up by people in the Democratic Party. It's not hard to find. You can just go to YouTube and watch them as a reminder, even though most liberals could live several lifetimes without ever needing the cops. Conservatives, well, oftentimes what happens there is they don't want to hold the cops accountable because they're searching under every rock for a reason to blame the victim. George Floyd was on drugs, or you're always looking for, well, okay, the cop is maybe a bad apple, but can we find some reason? Actually, I forget her name. She's a very famous Black journalist who used to work for Glenn Beck's The Blaze. She put out a documentary movie. I can put the word documentary in quotes, about how the victims of police violence in the United States, Connor knows. Oh, you remember her name? Connor, if you can put that up. She put out a movie in Candace Owens, thank you, in which she does actually go through all of the victims, well-known victims of police violence, and claims that they're the cause of their own death at the hands of police. And it's extremely popular among conservatives. Well, let me tell you what's missing from these discourses at a final conclusion. It's a more radical position. It's helpful to have it. We should think about it. It should be present. It should be a part of the conversation. So from 14th century etymology, there is a Latin root, radicalis. I put it here in the comments. It's supposed to be in italics, but I don't know how to do that in the comments here. Radicalis. And it's the root, well, no pun intended, it's the root of the word radical, and it actually refers to root. Radicalis means root, and it refers to the word radical. And you might find this interesting the next time you're eating a radish. When you're eating a radish, it's a root vegetable, right? A radish is a root, and it's named radish not by accident. It comes from the Latin radicalis. It's radical to go to try to think about problems at the root causes. And I think that this is what it means to be a communist today, is to try to think about problems at their root causes. And I would go so far as to say, and to be a radical, therefore, because this is the definition of what it means to be a radical, is to look for problems, to analyze problems at their root causes. And I would even ask this question to all of you. Are you even addressing problems if you're ignoring their root causes? Or, let me rephrase it, to what extent are you addressing problems if you are not addressing them at their root causes? And communists, they do have a long international history of radical thought and action, trying to think about problems at their root causes. You can see that in the anti-fascist gatherings of Antifa, and in many other examples. And I think that in as much as we still need attention to root causes, that's one piece. And in as much as we still need abolitionist movements in the world today, the question of what it means to be a communist is never going to go away. And we show what it means in the causes we make. And I will stop with that.